Slavery was very common almost everywhere in the ancient world. Babylon and Assyria, Persia, China, Greece. It was partly slave labor that built civilization. Slaves mostly came from the ranks of defeated enemies in battle, prisoners of war. Slavery also was a punishment for some sorts of criminal behavior. And if someone were so deeply in debt that they couldn't pay the debt, they would become a slave for the debt to be released. The slavery of the Hebrew people in Egypt, as told in the story from Exodus, was, however, a really different sort. The wholesale enslavement of an alien resident population made up of a particular ethnic nationality had not happened before, and wouldn't happen again really until 1619 in what was then the New World. Here, slaves were imported for the purpose. In Egypt, they were the neighbors. They'd been there for many generations. And by then, the Egyptians had forgotten, it says, why the Hebrews had come, or even maybe that they had come. They just knew that they were getting too big. So they put them into bondage to keep them in their place, to keep their spirit down. But the Hebrew spirit wouldn't be kept down. And the problem was that this was not their place. Their real place was back in Canaan, in the Promised Land, from where Joseph and his brothers had originally come, and they had stayed in Egypt for far too long. They perhaps had come to think that Egypt was really where they belonged, that was their real home. And so God had to remind them this may have been the way. But I don't want to get too much into blaming the victim here. Was the Egyptian leaders, according to our story, certainly the Egyptian population that was really at fault. And maybe they were worried about the Hebrews growing too strong and powerful, being too much competition, but maybe they just needed their labor to build the cities. And the whole they're getting too big stuff was a rationalization for that. People need to find rationalizations for committing evil acts. This could, I suppose, though, only be a Hebrew story. There's no clear evidence, archaeological, documentary, in Egyptian sources for this enslaved people or the exodus that follows. I've talked before how many of the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the stories of Jacob's 12 sons and the tribes may have been written as a combination of tribal memories in order to weave together this larger group that would become the Hebrew nation. And it's possible, I guess, that this Egyptian story was a way to include some other people in that formation. The name of Moses was certainly an Egyptian name. It's really an Egyptian suffix for a name. It means son of. There were pharaohs named Thutmose, which means son of the god Thoth, or Ramses, which means son of the god Ra. There are some similarities, I guess, with the Hebrew word for deliverer, but those are kind of a stretch, and there's no connection to any word meaning lifted up or drawn up. Sigmund Freud speculated in his book Moses and Monotheism that this group that left Egypt and moved into Canaan was made up of refugees from the failed monotheistic reform of Pharaoh Akhenaten. They would have gone by the way of Midian, which already had connections with the 12 tribes, and then continuing on found their fellow monotheists when they entered into Canaan. I think that's interesting. It's definitely speculative, and it's really not very important. Regardless of the factual historicity of the story of enslavement in Egypt and the Exodus, this is a setting for the Hebrews truly becoming a people. It's a creation story, an origin story. The Bible isn't a history book filled with facts. It's a revelation filled with truth. And the truth that's being conveyed here is that this people is a chosen people. A people of the law, the way, the Torah. And like any of the stories in the Bible, most any of them, this story can be read on a number of different levels. Freud can read it for his historical fantasies, and the Hebrew people certainly can read it as an origin story, but it also can be looked at metaphorically and more generally, as well as personally. People, I think, quite often get the feeling that they're lost somehow, that they've fallen out of touch with who they really are and where they really come from. I think that's the primary teaching of the Garden of Eden story, expelled from the first home. And along with the toil and pain that came from living in the world, we also often feel that we've journeyed far from home. Joseph went to Egypt and saved his brothers from starvation. But as I've said, by the time this story is written, they've forgotten where home is. The Promised Land seemed just as unattainable and far as Eden. But unto them a child was born. Unto them a son was given. When we're feeling lost and homeless, feeling almost like a slave building someone else's cities, a glimmer of hope can begin to arise, a hint of a memory that life could be more than just making bricks for granaries and tombs. A hint that we can draw up from the waters of unconsciousness something redeeming, something that will deliver us. And given that, we should notice a couple of things in this story that I hadn't really thought of until looking at it this time. Maybe Moses was the star of the show, but all the supporting casts were women. It was the women in this story that saved and enabled the life of the child to go on. The Egyptian midwives saved the Hebrew baby boys. Pharaoh had wanted them dead. Patriarchal power can't really go along with any kind of deep spirituality. Our modern, objective, rational thinking has us all enslaved in some way because that's better for progress. It's better that we think that this is all there is. We'll work harder, they think. And yet something within us, someone maybe within us, won't let that happen. The Levite woman gives him birth. And when he can no longer be hidden, she puts him in a reed basket, waterproofs it with bitumen and pitch. It becomes a safe place, a container in which to enter the waters. And he's watched over by his sister and saved by Pharaoh's daughter. All these women with their feminine power, which subverts Pharaoh's deadly intent. And we all need a basket. A place to be safe when we set out on a spiritual journey while we're still pretty helpless. And for my whole ministry, and still, I've seen the church as potentially that safe place. We may need to fill in some holes and seal some cracks, but I think that the church, our community, our sacraments, our teaching, our love, can get us across our times of danger and doubt. And to do that, we need to draw on the feminine that's a part of each of us, although it hasn't been very respected. It's the only way really to contradict and escape patriarchal slavery. When I got my degree in depth psychology, my dissertation was about this place, Hunakul. I've called it because that's what the indigenous people called it, Hunakul, this hill. And one of the dominant archetypal themes that I discerned and wrote about was the consistent manifestation of women's leadership and power in this place. You could see that in the stories of the indigenous Ohlone people. You see it in the Theosophists who first cleared this land and built McGowan House over 100 years ago. You see it in the leadership of this St. James congregation since the time they came up here. In one way or another. The child of redemption is born of a woman. But notice also that the deliverance is embedded in Pharaoh's own household. There's no slave rebellion. There's no revolutionary forces standing against the armies of Pharaoh. There's no black and white choices, good and evil views. There's just a chink in the armor, a chink in Pharaoh's armor, a contradiction that gets introduced into an oppressive, rigorous system. And at first, it may not even have been noticed. But that child will grow. That seed will begin to sprout until even Pharaoh realizes that he himself can never be free while the Hebrew people remained in bondage. And our material lives, our biological lives, our family lives, our communities, our institutions can never really fulfill themselves in the world as long as we're out of touch with the Spirit. Sadly, there are many people, maybe most, in our secular society that see religion as a remnant of the past. Outdated, irrelevant. The honored, departed memory of someone like John the Baptist who wouldn't draw any crowds today, or Elijah of legend, or Jeremiah, or a prophet. But reading these lessons at a time like ours, when contradictions are multiple and obvious, we need to see that child within as the coming one, as the anointed one, who will give us the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Thanks be to God.